Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you to the organizers for accepting this short minute paper in the conference. I'm really happy to participate again. And congratulations to WAL and its partners for keeping the conference. Its 10th anniversary. I think it's proof of the work well done and the relevance of these discussions. The paper that Sandra and I are developing the title that we have is called Portugal and the Easternisation of Europe's Security and Defense Policies. As we mentioned, we are still developing the paper. So in a sense, this is an opportunity for us to present to you the ideas that we want to develop and hear also your feedback to help us develop the paper through. So I think that's what conferences are also for. Sandra and I have worked together. We have similar interests in terms of EU security and defense policies, also EU policies towards the countries in Eastern Europe and beyond, so the former Soviet space, Russia and others. And so this is a bit of a spin-off for us to look at what the Easternization, what we've called the Easternization of Europe's security and defense policies means for the EU integration process, for cohesion inside inside NATO, and we do that by looking at a case, of course, that we are familiar with, which is Portugal. So, in a sense, I think we are trying to contribute to the debate of what does this new shift towards the East mean for already ongoing integration processes that we are so familiar with. So we start with the literature on small states and marginality to understand what strategies countries in this position use to leverage their national interests, and in this case, how they do that in the context of the ongoing integration in terms of security and defense, not only in NATO, which is of course a long-standing process, but more increasingly so also in the EU under the EU defense policy that is fastly developing. And of course, the war in Ukraine just sped up this process. So how is a country like Portugal adjusting to this? So the literature on small states and marginality helps us here. Just very quickly, some key issues that we intend to address or we are considering addressing. Small states tend to leverage their relative marginal position through bargain or trying to capitalize on their unique selling points to the multilateral groups that they integrate. So if small states tend to look for the issues that they are expert on or the specificities that geography brings to their diplomatic relations and so on, and try to leverage that against the obvious imbalance of power that they face in bigger settings. For small states also, national interests, of course, tend to become much more intertwined with collective interests. That's why multilateralism is of interest to so many small states, because in multilateral settings, the interests of bigger powers become intertwined with the interests that small states have. And so this is something to take into consideration when we look at the current context. Another note that I would like to make at this point is that for small states and for these processes of leveraging power, context is quite important. So a favorable context can mean that small states can more easily advance their interests and find selling points that make them more relevant for other more powerful actors. But likewise, if the context is not favorable, they will be even more disadvantaged. So we need to take this into consideration when we look at the case study that we have as well. And so when we look at the case of Portugal, these are some of the issues that we are seeing and that we need to assess in terms of the impacts that this will have, not only in the position of Portugal, of course, but perhaps more interestingly also on the nature of the integration processes in EU and NATO. So the first issue has to do with perhaps with this concept of Easternization. So what do we mean by Easternization? And here it means both, of course, a geographical shift in threat assessment. And we see that, for instance, when we look at the EU Strategic Compass or NATO's strategic concept document. So we see that threat assessments are now much more focused on the Eastern Front. These threats are more urgent. They require more attention and means, of course. So all the security efforts that are ongoing, they tend to be more reinforced at the eastern border and also in the countries that are in that region. So that means that both inside EU and NATO, Baltic countries, Poland and Romania, for instance, will be much more relevant for the efforts that are ongoing, but also the attention will be focusing much more on Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and others that we've heard also before. What Easternization also means is that there is a shift in decision-making inside the EU. And the long-term effects of this shift are something that concerns a small country like Portugal much more than necessarily the threat assessment, because I think we can balance the threat assessment by pointing out that what is happening in the south is also relevant for managing the conflict in the east, but the shifts in decision-making tend to create path dependence, and therefore this will have a lingering effects on how countries in the margin or far away from the center of decision can contrary this trend. So also we need to add to this that enlargement perspectives will tend to reinforce that trend of Easternization. If we look at the Balkan accession, now the perspectives for Ukraine and Moldova, but also, of course, Turkey's accession process. So the focus tends to be for the EU to look at its eastern dimension rather than its southern dimension, where previous enlargements have kind of settled the borders of the EU there. So we also need to understand that not only the trend to Easternization has been felt with the previous enlargement, of course, with so many Central and Eastern European countries entering the EU, but also there is another factor. The Troika interventions in the post-2008 crisis really made the role of the southern countries much more fragile. We all remember how the divisions inside the EU left the countries in the south in a poor position. And also, for instance, if you want to consider that the US is very important and relations with the US are very important for the security and defense policies, both of NATO and the EU. For a country like Portugal, which was always a privileged interlocutor for the United States in Europe, the enlargement of the EU and NATO to other Atlanticist countries in Central and Eastern Europe has also made Portugal less relevant for the global power in that case. So we are at a conjunction where Portuguese national security and defense interests will need to be reassessed and readjusted with this Easternization movement. So this is what we mean by Easternization. I think it's a process that has many dimensions, and we hope that the paper can tease that out also for our audiences. The second element, when we look at the application of these theories of small states and how they promote their interests, and looking at the case of Portugal, is that Portugal has used its contributions to NATO missions and EU missions to present itself as a committed partner to both projects, as a partner committed to solidarity among allies, and of course, keeping a privileged interlocution with global powers. I'm thinking here, of course, the US and France and the UK. So by participating in complicated missions for NATO, like Iraq or Afghanistan, and in the Balkans, for instance, Portugal was always positioned itself as a leading contributor power, engaged, available. And also in the EU, Portugal has participated in all EU military missions from day one. All of them have had a participation of Portuguese forces. So this is a capital that Portugal, of course, has been harnessing for itself in its conversations with its partners. However, maybe just another element here has to do, of course, with the multilateral. Portugal has also been very much engaged in multilateral formats for peace and security, kind of reinforcing also its availability to contribute with military stuff. However, when we look at the ongoing processes of speeding the common security and defense policy, NATO's focus more on territorial defense and deterrence, we see the difficulties that a country like Portugal is facing in keeping up with these trends, because the contributions that we were making were more to the out of area missions for NATO, for the expeditionary forces that went and supported stabilization elsewhere. When the focus is now on territorial defense and strategic assets for deterrence, a country like Portugal tends to be in a more difficult position to contribute, because great powers have the means for territorial defense more often and for deterrence. So we need to reassess also to what extent our contributions need to be adjusted. And of course, this will mean a more demanding situation for our national budget, more investment at a time, of course, when also Portugal is facing the economic impacts, like most countries in Europe, of the war in Ukraine and the crisis, the post-COVID crisis, and so on. So increases in defense spending put, of course, a great strain on national resources, and this will tend to be something that may make the position of Portugal more fragile. Another element, before moving on to the conclusions, is, of course, Portugal's geopolitical interests. They tend to lie more on the south, on the southern flank, than on the eastern flank. And for the moment, security concerns in the south are a second-tier priority for global powers, for regional powers. So there has been a constant effort by the Portuguese diplomacy to link the issues, the security issues in the south with the security situation in the east, namely pointing out to Russia's activities in Africa and elsewhere, and linking this to this narrative of global competition that, of course, we see becoming more institutionalized now with the enlargement of BRICS, and with a much more active foreign policy in the south, both by the US and the European Union, just thinking of this global gateway project that the Commission has been pushing forward as a means to be more present and kind of reinforce partnership with the global south. So in that sense, of course, Portugal has been trying to counter this tendency of less attention being paid to security issues in the south, where it has a clear priority and where Portugal is a relevant interlocutor, but other elements are making this difficult. If you think, for instance, that piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, which had been a major concern for the EU over the last decade, has now decreased for 2 or 3 years in a row, meaning that the tendency is to look at those issues as being solved, at least from the perspective of the European nations and their commercial interests there. So the tendency will be for less investment on the Gulf of Guinea. If you look at other security concerns in African conflicts, even though they are highly relevant for security in Europe, they will tend to be seen as less prioritary right now. So, of course, the country lacks the means to act alone in many of these countries, unlike, for instance, France. And also, besides lacking the means to act alone, this idea that Portugal is a privileged interlocutor with Africa or with Latin America, it's still true, but we are no longer we don't have a monopoly on that interlocution, which means that other countries are also good interlocutors these days. And so this is also a challenge for our diplomacy and for the promotion of our interests. Finally, also on this issue, on the relations with the South, the fact that Portugal has been from day one aligned with Western powers and within the Western Bloc in responding to the Ukraine war with solidarity and of course condemning Russia's actions in line with US and other European powers. This has also taken a toll on its ability to speak with the Global South. So this is, we need to balance the pros and cons of this, and we need to understand how Portugal may be perceived as lacking independence from these powers, and therefore making its interlocution perhaps less relevant or less interesting for Southern powers at the current moment. So in overall, the context over the last couple of years perhaps has not been the most favorable for Portugal. So my conclusions, our conclusions, basically this idea that small states, we have a more difficult time in shaping EU defense policies and NATO strategy in the context of global power rivalry and the focus on territorial defense and deterrence. Unless these small states are directly engaged in the conflict. And of course, Portugal is contributing to the efforts in securing the Eastern Front since 2014, and has also been able to have Eastern European countries participate in missions in Africa, creating here this solidarity, but we are not directly engaged in the conflict, and so we will tend to be marginalized as a small country. Participation means, of course, financial and political efforts that can destabilize national politics and societies, and we will need to see how far Portugal will manage these financial and human effort that an ongoing war in the Eastern Front may put on our resources, and that will speed up the defense integration process in the EU. For small and peripheral states who value their geographical position and their multilateral apparatus, the current context may pose short-term challenges. Portugal has been inside the ad hoc multilateral formats that have conveyed to support the war effort and so on. We are, of course, EU members and NATO members, and this means that we participate, but multilateralism in itself has been marginalized. Yes. 15 minutes are gone?
Oh, yes, 3 minutes ago.
Okay, so just to finish, there remain, of course, opportunities to tie issues together, to build coalitions, and to value its role as an interlocutor, but risks are much higher at this stage. And the mid and long-term effects in the Euro-Atlantic integration need also to be assessed for our understanding of what this Easternization movement means for a small country like Portugal. So thanks so much, Sandra, for your time.